Ireland, land of 1,000 kings. Here, Celt monarchs presided over a golden age of culture, only to fall victim to England's mightiest weapon, the castle. From the crucible of war, Bunratty Castle emerged as a towering symbol of colonial power. Relive the conquest of a nation through the history of the fighting fortress Bunratty, next on Great Castles of Europe. Ireland after the time of Christ was a wild, fertile hinterland with a destiny all its own. Rome's conquering legions never set foot on its shores. So while Europe bent under the weight of Roman administration, Ireland's Celts studied nature's law. As interpreted by Celt priests and lawgivers, nature called for sacrifice and ritual, fealty to the order of creation. Its cycles were sacred. Life and death worked in balance. Cattle were nature's gift, the source of food and clothing. Those who owned the most cattle were the earth's chosen kings. Ireland boasted 150 kings. To guard their cattle, they erected circular homesteads of stone and wood. Though largely nomadic, their kin groups found refuge in these ring forts during harsh seasons. With forts, they staked their claim to pasture land, shared among the kin. The simple Celt fortress consisted of a lumber palisade on a stone foundation. Inside the spacious courtyard were living quarters, granaries, even nurseries for the youngest kin. There were special places for the seasonal tasks of husking and winnowing. The Celts forged iron tools capable of great precision and artistry. Wolves posed a constant threat. So did rival clans. The ring fort Cahir Ballyconarga dispels the notion that pre-Christian Celts were bucolic, peace-loving farmers. Whatever clan built it lived in constant fear for their lives. The ring fort's first line of defense is a surrounding field of sharp limestone pillars, mostly hidden in tall grass. These made mass attack by foot soldiers difficult. On horseback, impossible. As raiders approached, they'd come under a hail of stones, arrows, and spears, hobbled all the while by the sharp pillars. Aggressors who made it to the fort were confronted by double stone walls, which were once crowned by a sharp wooden palisade. At this obstacle, attackers might be willing to consider a siege or pick an easier target. For the Celts, embracing nature's cycle of life meant making provisions for death, a tradition in Ireland dating back to the Stone Age. The Polna Bron Portal Dolmen once held the bones of 16 children and adults. The Celts incorporated these haunting Stone Age structures into their own system of beliefs. They honored the spirits present in all of nature's manifestations. Trees, rocks, and water were especially sacred. In the 5th century, sacred belief in Ireland underwent monumental change. The high crosses at Kilfenora Cathedral show how the natural shapes of Celtic art came to decorate towering stone crucifixes. Christianity, brought from England by St. Patrick, instantly appealed to the islanders' affinity for kings. Ireland's church centered around independent monasteries, which became great centers of scholarship and art. They produced some of the Middle Age's finest works, like the Book of Kells, an illuminated manuscript of the four Gospels. While Europe languished in the dark ages of the 7th and 8th centuries, Ireland enjoyed its golden age. Europe wouldn't experience anything like it for another 800 years. Ireland's golden age ended in the late 8th century when Scandinavian Vikings began bloody raids on the island. For the first time in 1,000 years, Ireland was attacked by outsiders. Her kingdoms were slow to organize resistance against the Viking onslaught. Divided, the kingdoms fell, losing their women, their herds, their lives. In the 11th century, the Irish King of Munster distinguished himself through fearless attacks on the invaders. His name was Brian Boru. Raising an army, he met the Vikings head-on at Clontarf on Good Friday in 1014. There, Brian Boru died, but the power of the invaders was crushed. His victory was perhaps the last time Ireland would unify against outside forces. Norman armies struck only 100 years after the Vikings were defeated. In their conquest of England, the Normans had forged the decisive military weapon of its age, the castle. England's King Henry II boasted the largest military in Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. In the 12th century, he unleashed this force on Ireland. As queen of the Norman strategy, the castle reigned supreme. In Munster province, Bunratty is the most magnificent of these castles. Castles were fiercely challenged centers from which the king's barons guarded territory and made raids to conquer more. Bunratty Castle dominates an estuary at the confluence of the Great Shannon River and the smaller river Ratty. In the Celt tongue, Bunratty itself means mouth of the Ratty. Thomas de Clare, a Norman nobleman, erected the first stone castle here in the 13th century on the site of an older wooden fort. The king granted de Clare the site while encouraging the baron to take all the land he could conquer in Munster. De Clare and his soldiers did just that, driving out the native Celt inhabitants. England's colonization of Ireland had begun. Of course, the North Munster clans responded with furious resistance. The two most powerful clans were the O'Briens, descendants of the High King Brian Boru, and the McNamaras. In daring nighttime raids, they made repeated attacks on fortified Bunratty Castle. Critically, however, the two clans failed to unite their armies against the Norman de Clare. The O'Briens even had trouble within their own ranks. In 1277, Brian Ruadh O'Brien believed that he'd been cheated out of the kingship of Thomond. Foolishly, he came to declare for help. The Baron received him as a guest of honor at Bunratty and held a grand feast in his honor. It was the last meal of a condemned man. Brian Ruadh O'Brien's appalling fate is recorded in the ancient annals of Lough Key. After they had poured their blood into the same vessel, and after they had pledged Christ's friendship, and after they had exchanged mutual vows by the relics, bells, and croziers of Munster, de Clare had Brian Ruadh taken outside and torn asunder by horses, his head cut off, and his body gibbeted to a tall post outside the castle of Bunratty. The O'Briens' reprisal was devastating. In 1280, all the clan's armies attacked Bunratty and besieged the castle for so long that the residents and surrounding town were unable to bury their dead. An epidemic raged for months. In 1318, the Irish finally won control of Bunratty by killing Thomas de Clare's son. Before leaving for England with ships docked nearby, his bitter wife set fire to Bunratty and the surrounding town. According to the annals of Lough Key, what she left behind wasn't worth plundering. Bunratty was deserted, empty, wrapped in fire, from which time to this, never one of the breed of de Clare has come back to claim it. Following the de Clare's dramatic exit, Bunratty changed hands between the warring McNamaras and O'Briens. In the struggle, the castle burned several times. Yet each time, the region's most highly prized military resource rose from the ashes to be wielded by clan chiefs. With it, they enforced their authority as father of the clan. In the early 1500s, Murrough O'Brien was one such chief. As the head of the O'Briens, he was clan landlord, councillor, and judge. He settled disputes, negotiated marriages, and meted out punishment as he saw fit. His leadership was the linchpin of Munster's Celt society. Bunratty was its enforcer. As a jailhouse, the castle's dungeon made a lasting impression on wrongdoers. More than 15 feet deep, the pit has no access except by rope from above. Intimidating Bunratty was in every way Munster Province's ultimate treasure, power incarnate. But in the early 16th century, the nature of power was about to change. In 1508, Henry VIII became King of England. By the time he was dubbed King of the Irish colony some years later, his navy was a virtually unbeatable, far-reaching force, especially frightening to regions near the sea, like Limerick and Bunratty Castle. To the Celt chiefs in his zone of power, Henry offered a devil's bargain, a policy called surrender and re-grant. In exchange for peace, Henry would give Irish chieftains a grant of land and a title. Murrough O'Brien, the 57th King of Thomond, accepted this deal. With this act, the Irish king became the first Earl of Thomond. The implications for the clan were staggering. Their ancestral territory became royal land. Clan leaders' authority was cut out from under them. The Celt kingdom was reduced to serfdom under the crown. As part of the deal, The Earl also consented to raise his son as a Protestant. Twice damned in the eyes of his kin, Murrough O'Brien lived out his life in Munster as a pariah. Now the reviled O'Brien, and later his heirs, lived in open war with their kinsmen, clan leaders who had not surrendered their legacy. These Celt kings chose to fight against the overwhelming forces of the crown. Their defensive strongholds were a special kind of ring fort called a crannog, basically a fort built on a man-made island. The crannog survived side by side with castles until the 16th century. Then the Celts' history as an independent people came to an end. Henry VIII hastened their final chapter with a tragic drama enacted throughout Ireland. In 1541, the English king decided that Celts living in cottages would be easier to control than those holed up in ring forts and crannogs like this. He ordered the forts destroyed, the people driven into the fields. Against the cannons of the English war machine, the Irish kings were helpless. With real power in the hands of the remote empire, even Bunratty's significance fell. It was no longer necessary to intimidate. A united Irish and English aristocracy kept the clans in check. The O'Brien earls, like the 4th Earl Donogh, were emissaries of the British Empire. They were no longer fighters, but administrators. Bunratty continued to serve the crown, but now as a lavish center of hospitality. Donogh added top rooms in the southern towers and inserted stained glass in many windows. The widely traveled Earl brought back much of this finery from Renaissance-era France. There he found the inspiration for the flowers and plants adorning the ceiling's stucco work. By the 1700s, Bunratty's transformation from a crude fort to a resplendent Renaissance palace was complete. Yet Celtic traces remain. This is Sheila na gig, an ancient fertility symbol. In the social swirl of castle life, courtiers now replaced soldiers. In place of war parties, the earls held banquets. Surrounding them at all times were attendants and administrators, hangers-on, anxious to press business. Marshals, stewards, pages, footboys, the list numbered in the hundreds. In 1646, the Pope's nuncio, Cardinal Rinuccini, paid a visit to the 6th Earl, Barnaby. He wrote, "I have no hesitation in asserting that Bunratty is the most beautiful spot I have ever seen. In Italy, there is nothing like the palace and grounds of Lord Thomond, nothing like its ponds and parks and its 3,000 head of deer." High praise indeed. Yet the 6th Earl built up the castle's defenses, guessing, perhaps, that Munster's tranquil era might end. He was right. In the middle of the 17th century, the English Civil War broke out between the Royalists, loyal to Charles I, and the Parliamentarians. Irish rebels laid siege outside Bunratty. Sir William Penn and his parliamentarian forces holed up within, grateful for the castle's defenses. After penetrating the outer wall, an infiltrating band would likely head for the basement door. A murder hole above it allowed defenders to pour hot oil or water on them. Entering one of the main doorways might have presented less of a challenge. Still, all the doors are narrow, and the staircases rise clockwise, giving defenders more sword room than attackers. For the children's protection, earlier O'Brien earls had created child-sized staircases. Only the tiniest adult could follow. Ultimately, the Irish Confederates forced Sir William Penn's surrender. He gave up the castle to the rebels and set sail for Kinsale. Miraculously, when the smoke cleared, Bunratty's reigning earl managed to retain ownership. Of the crafty 6th Earl, it was said, he succeeded in being royalist, rebel, and Roundhead at one and the same time, in full possession of his estates. The Royalists ultimately failed. Cromwell's reign as Lord Protector helped bring about the Protestant ascendancy that dominated the island for the next 3 centuries. Bunratty's fighting history was over. Its decline into ruin began. The last O'Brien Earl moved to a mansion. In a parting gesture of indifference, he caved Bunratty's roof in. In the colony, all roof dwellings were taxed. The castle lay abandoned for over a century. While colonialism's ultimate tool languished, the colonial era continued to bear bitter fruit.
With the powers that were granted to Patrick, I bank this fire. May the angels keep it, no enemy scatter it. Christ's sword on the door till tomorrow's light.
In the 19th century, Irish peasants subsisted mostly on potatoes. Meat, barley, and wheat were exported for English tables. When the potato crop suffered from blight in the 1840s, the impact was devastating. More than 1 million Irish succumbed to disease and death by starvation. As the 20th century began, it looked as if Bunratty, like dozens of other Irish castles, would remain a ruin forever. But in 1945, it became the prized possession of one more strong master. Lord Gort, the 7th Viscount Gort, bought Bunratty for £2,000 and restored the fighting fortress to the style of its most magnificent era. The regal South Solar, featuring an elaborate Tudor ceiling, served as the family's private apartments. Most of its furnishings are from the 16th and 17th centuries. The Lord and Lady were originally from Northern Ireland and kept homes in England as well as Canada. When Bunratty's restoration was finished in the 1960s, the Gorts gave the castle to the people of Ireland. Today, visitors can enjoy the majestic Great Hall, restored to the spare elegance of the daring age of the O'Brien Earls. Bunratty Castle hosts thousands of tourists each year, reminding them of that bygone era of clan chiefs and kings, empires conquered and lost again. It shows one of history's most daunting faces of power in the heroic land of 1,000 kings.